Hello there, I'm Leo Waldock and this is Kit Guru TV, and this is the Asus A88X-Gamer Motherboard. Now, as the model code suggests, it uses an AMD A88X chipset, which means it supports the FM2 Plus socket, so it's fully supportive of the latest Kaveri type APU. APU is APU, that means it's CPU plus GPU. AMD puts more emphasis on the graphics than the processor, that's where their strength lies, whereas Intel with their Core i5, Core i7 is more CPU than GPU. You get decent CPU and some graphics. The fact that Asus has gone with the gamer name strongly suggests that they're supportive of this, and the combination of some CPU plus a lot of GPU, question is, can you play games on it or not? We have previously seen an MSI A80X gaming motherboard, that was a G45 model. So let's move the camera in closer and see what features we've got. Before we look at the board itself, let's just have a quick rattle through the accessories. You get your Asus manual, it's the standard piece of decent writing from them, driver disc, I/O shield, and a couple of SATA cables, one straight, one right angled, which is after all you need for most PC builds if you've got a single drive and a single optical drive. Now, this is an Asus board, so you might leap to the assumption that it's quite expensive. However, we've seen this board on sale at £75 and £80 depending on which outlet you go to. Quite recently we looked at the MSI A88X G45 gaming board, which was slightly more expensive. It was about £10 more than this. And Asus is generally more expensive than MSI, so it's quite a surprise to see this way around. Now, if we take a quick tour around the hardware, on the I/O panel we've got one legacy PS2, we've got some USB 2, we've got graphics outputs, which for this AMD board are very important because you are almost certainly going to be using the graphics from the APU. And we've got some USB 3, plus also SPDIF for digital audio. That's all well and good. Hopefully you can see that there says Intel Ethernet. I have to confess, this is the first time I've noticed Intel hardware used on an AMD motherboard. Asus made a kind of disparaging comment about the fact they're using a high quality Intel NIC rather than inferior Realtek or a Qualcomm killer. Which is sort of fair enough and slightly comical. What it actually says to me is they're doing this to differentiate themselves from the competition that uses other networking hardware. Realistically, most of the motherboards that Asus makes and sells use Intel hardware, Intel sockets, and either Realtek or very likely Intel networking. It makes perfect sense to also use Intel NICs on their AMD boards. Properly good hardware, very good reputation of course, just novel to see it. Down here we have a creative audio chip. In fact, it's creative software on other hardware. I suspect underneath it's Realtek. And then we have a whole bunch of expansion slots, as this board is almost 80X size, it's slightly slimmer. The main graphics slot is PCI Express 3, the secondary slot is PCI Express 2, and then we've got some other ×1 slots and also some legacy PCI slots. This leaves me in a bit of a quandary. If you're buying yourself a Kaveri, which is a relatively expensive in AMD terms APU, you're looking there at about £125 for the top line A10 7850K, which is a decent piece of hardware. But if you start plugging in graphics cards, when you have a low-end graphics card, you can link it to the APU and you get a combination of the two, and that's a good thing. However, once you get beyond low-end graphics cards and start moving to mid-range, the graphics card is doing almost all of the work and the APU is putting in very little effort. In other words, it's more or less basically a CPU. And the fact is AMD CPUs these days are not that great. If you're going down the halfway decent graphics card route, you might just well think, should I just go down the Intel socket and dump AMD altogether, just use a Radeon graphics card. The idea you're going to use two graphics cards in Crossfire on a board like this, I just can't see it, unless of course you have another PCI Express expansion card you want to use. Legacy PCI slots, fair enough, 3 of them. I cannot begin to comprehend what you're going to do with those. Underneath this whacking great big heatsink we have the chipset, and that heatsink is held in place with a couple of screws. You'll notice that the heatsinks on the power regulation hardware are held in place with plastic pop pins, which isn't the greatest solution, but you can be confident if Asus has gone down that route, then they're happy it all works. Lifting the camera up higher, I hope that you can see that the EPS connector has a decent amount of space around it. It's very easy to connect to it, and similarly the main power connector, that's absolutely a doddle. The SATA ports, you've got this ridiculous number, you've got 8 in total supported by the chipset, and they've kind of done this double stacking thing here, so you've got 4 here and another 4 there. 8 SATA connectors is, I don't know, what's that, 4 or 5 more than anyone is likely to need. On the plus side, they take up almost no space, so there's no harm done. At the foot of the board, we've got a whole bunch of headers, but the main ones you'll be interested in are USB 2, the likes of COM and TPM and such like. The idea you're going to use those is fairly visible. At the side here we have a header for USB 3, so that's 2 more ports there to go along with the 2 ports on the I/O panel. Basically all the features that you need are supported, and that's the main thing. The hardware, the way Asus described this to me is that essentially what you've got here is previous generation Republic of Gamers type quality. You're basically 1 generation behind the Intel spec, so give or take this is the equivalent of a Z87 board, my apologies. Obviously Z97 is current, so this is the sort of hardware you got last year from Asus Republic of Gamers. Obviously the ROG boards are horribly expensive and quite gorgeous. So for example, you've got eLNA capacitors on the audio, and here we have 6 phases for power regulation for the CPU, and that would be then these 3 would be for 3 there would be for memory. Incidentally, I was using AMD branded Radeon R9 memory for testing. And I've left it in just because it looks the part. Now at this stage in the proceedings, let's say a few words about the Asus UEFI or BIOS setup screen. It works absolutely flawlessly. You can control it with mouse and keyboard, and it moves around absolutely beautifully. All the options that you would expect to see are at your disposal. Now initially I thought the only reason for going in there would be to update the BIOS, download the file from the Asus website, bung it on a flash drive, and then use the tool that's within the UEFI to update the setup. And then once you've done that, bump up the memory speed. By default, this Radeon R9 memory runs at 1866 MHz, however its maximum speed is 2400 MHz. So you enable the amp or whatever profile, and there's no need to do any sort of manual overclocking with voltages and things. You just basically click a button and it does it for you. So when I was having a look around the setup screen, I came across AI Overclock Tuner, which sounded quite promising. However, that simply increased memory speed. It didn't touch the APU speed at all. So that was the equivalent of enabling amp, job done. And performance with the memory running faster was perfectly acceptable. Then I had another look around and I found the Easy Tuning Wizard, which I'd missed at first glance. And that's quite a neat thing. It's basically a 4 or 5 step process. It asks you how you're going to use your system, graphics rendering, gaming, or just everyday use. Naturally, I sort of went for the option that implied maximum performance. And it goes, righty ho, and increased APU performance by, it said, 13%. Now initially the Kaveri was running at 3.7 GHz and turboing to 4 GHz. After the Easy Tuning Wizard had done its job, it ran at a straightforward 4.3 GHz, no turbo, it's just a straight speed. And that was absolutely fine. To be honest, I didn't expect a massive amount from it. However, it bumped up PC Mark 8. Instead of running just under 4,600 marks, it delivered just under 4,800. No great shakes. However, in Tomb Raider at high preset, previously the system had delivered 23 frames per second with increased APU speed 31 frames per second. Quite a surprising increase. I have to say that during benchmarks the system did freeze once or twice until I increased the hardware monitoring profile from kind of silent, where the fan on the liquid cooling system, which is why I've taken off the standard frame. I increased this fan speed from silent to performance. I didn't go for full on 100%, but I bumped it up and thereafter the system seemed reasonably stable. But the blue screens suggest, and the freezing benchmarks do suggest, the system at 4.3 gigahertz is on the verge of a breakdown. Anywho, AI overclock tuner increases memory speed. Easy tuning wizard, it does what it says, more megahertz. One thing you can't see here is that under the board, under the audio chip, they have some rather cool red LED lighting. It kind of, because the board obviously is lifted very slightly from the motherboard tray, and it just illuminates that area. This ties in, I think, with the kind of the thought of an audio path, which is a little bit jokey in a way, but it does look rather nice. Obviously it only works if your case has a window, however. You'll notice that there are no micro buttons, there are no clever overclocking features, none of that. All that kind of Republic of Gamers hardware is missing, which is fine. This is a budget motherboard by any standards, so we're looking at the quality up here is kind of Republic of Gamers, except as I mentioned before, pop pins, not screws, so you know, don't get too carried away by the look of it. But the really cool features you get Republic of Gamers are absolutely not present on this board. Now, the reason I can be so cavalier and brisk when I'm racing through this review is that the hardware boils down to whatever memory you install, and you want decent memory with an AMD APU, because of course it feeds the graphics and it really does require decent memory. At least 1866, 2100 or 2166 is good, 2400, that'll do very nicely, thank you, it helps. So the memory matters, the APU matters, depending on which model you go for also affects which graphics core you have. That makes a big difference, and obviously it depends whether you leave this all blank or whether you put any expansion cards in there. The thing I liked least about this motherboard is its name. It's hard to say out loud, honestly. Asus A88X-Gamer. It's a tongue twister. The second thing I dislike about it is the length, the form factor. If you look, it's got a full 7 expansion slots. It's got a main PCI Express 3 slot, it's got a secondary PCI Express 2, it's actually a ×4 slot, PCI slots down the bottom, legacy PCI, and a couple of ×1 PCI Express. To my mind, you're never going to use them. You're going to install this board, use the APU, you're not going to put a graphics card in the machine, and away you go. Therefore, you don't need the full length of the board. So my immediate complaint is, why can't they make it micro ATX, better yet mini ITX? Let's just lop off some PCB, smaller case, and there you go. And I've come to the realization that this is my problem. It's not Asus or indeed MSI with their A88X-G45 gaming board, where they had a very similar layout to Asus. These companies aren't fools. And the problem, it goes back a year to when AMD brought out its latest APUs. I wanted to see a thing that was essentially a Core i3 but with really proper graphics. So I don't know, £99, 45 watt TDP, and you can play all the games on it. Of course that was absurd. But if it had a low TDP, that means you only need a really small, low profile, cheap air cooler. You can have half a board, you can have a small case, and you can have a tiny power supply, and it would cost you no money at all. It'd be brilliant. And of course, technically impossible. So my expectations are out of kilter. Now, these days we've only got the 2 FM2 Plus Kaveri APUs, and then 95 watt TDP. Earlier this year we saw the reduced TDP models, the 65 watt and 45 watt. You could pick the option in the BIOS. And the fact is, it just doesn't really work. Lopping down the power means that the APU just can't do its job properly. So you need 95 watts. If you've got 95 watts, you either need quite a decent air cooler or you need an all-in-one liquid cooler. And I've come to the realization, finally, it's taken me a year. With your Kaveri, you want a basic 120mm all-in-one liquid cooler. If you're doing that, you're into a small but still tower PC. Small form factor, HTPC and all that sort of thing. Unfortunately, it's not going to happen. And also, and this is a tragedy for me personally, a passively cool case with no noise whatsoever in an SSD. Unfortunately, with an APU from a Kaveri APU from AMD, that's just an unrealistic expectation on my part. So it's a full-length board. I don't like it, but it has to be that way. Asus, they've spec'd this thing like a previous generation, as they say, Z87 Republic Gamer board, and they've done a fine job. They've whopped in an awful lot of features, and it looks terrific. The other thing that I could live without is the plastic pop pins on the VRM heatsinks. Change those to screws, and my bitching would be over. What can I say? Pricing wise, I'm amazed they've done it so cheap. It either suggests Republic Gamer boards are horribly overpriced, or more likely that Intel charges a fortune for its chipsets, bit of both probably. Anyway, this is it's great. It inherits all the work they've done with the Z87 Republic Gamers and bungs it on a board that retails variously at £75 and £80, and that's very good indeed. In terms of performance, the other reason I've had issues with AMD and its Kaveris up to now is because they've been so close to being really good. Intel with its integrated graphics, as we know, you can't game with them, and when you go up from, I don't know, 15 frames per second to 20 frames per second, you go from ungameable to ungameable. It's out of the ballpark. Kaveri, it's absolutely on that cusp, depending on your settings. You can play games, you can. It's just a question of what settings you use, what quality settings, what resolution. And let's face it, most of us these days use full HD. So then it comes down to quality settings. You have to go medium, high, and ultra. For most games is going to be out of reach. But medium or high, fiddle around with settings, you're probably going to get a result, which I do find deeply impressive from a single piece of silicon. However, both MSI and Asus help out with their settings in the BIOS UEFI setup screen. So MSI gave us a couple of options with their board, and the question was, what speed did you run at? You could either bump up to 4.25 gigahertz, or we could go all the way to 4.55 gigahertz, and we found in intensive benchmarks 4.55 for this APU seemed to be too far, and the system would likely freeze when it's really heavily loaded. Asus has been slightly more conservative. They offer two options in their setup screen. You've got the AI overclock tuner, which looks promising, but actually simply controls memory speed. Now, this Radeon R9 memory defaults to 1866 megahertz, which is great. If you go into AI overclock tuner and you run the wizard, it basically enables AMP, which is 2400 megahertz, because that's the maximum speed for this memory. One click and you're done. And that helps performance because the APU graphics really need memory bandwidth. So if you've got fast memory, AMP, bump, job done. However, that's missing a trick. The better way to do it is to use the easy tuning wizard in the setup screen. And if you do that, it takes you through a 4 or 5 step process which says how you're going to use your system, regular day-to-day use or high-end gaming stroke graphics rendering. Obviously the question there is really, do you need performance? Do you need lots of performance? And what kind of cooler are you going to use? A little tiddly cooler, a box cooler as they call it, liquid cooler, or not sure? I couldn't bring myself to tick not sure. I imagine it'd just come back and say idiot. But if you want performance and you're using a proper cooler, it goes hello there. Whacks on 13% extra performance, and that's a combination of memory, APU core speed, and also graphics speed. Now, the APU standard runs at 3.7 gigahertz and turbos to 4 gigahertz. When you use Easy Tuning Wizard, 4.3 gigahertz. Memory, we've already discussed, 2400 megahertz. The other feature in the setup screen that it enables is the graphics core. The stock core speed, 720 megahertz, or you can boost to 900 megahertz. It boosts to 900. This is, you understand, without messing around in anywhere with voltages or manual speeds or anything. This is click, 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 done. With the Easy Tuning Wizard enabled and the speeds ramped up, we found that it ran well. However, I had to turn up the fan speed on the liquid cooler from silent mode to performance mode because the system was obviously getting slightly too hot and was freezing. Went to performance mode, didn't need to go to full on with 100% fan speed all the time. Performance mode was perfectly acceptable and the system behaved itself. And I didn't have any case fans going, so there was a degree of heat around the CPU socket, APU socket, but it worked. And the difference was this: just raising memory speed in PC Mark gave us a score just under 4600, which was actually very similar to the overclocked MSI G45 Gaming. And that's I'm quite certain, because AMD updates its drivers regularly and the APUs without a shadow of a doubt have benefited from the more or less monthly driver updates. There's little increments, they come along and they all add up, percent here, percent there, soon you're talking real money. With Easy Tuning Wizard enabled and the extra APU core speed and also the extra graphics speed, the PC Mark score went up from just under 4,600 to just under 4,800, which isn't massive. We'll take it. However, in 3D Mark Firestrike, the score went up from 1,500 to 1,700, and that eclipsed the previous scores we got from the MSI. Again, I'm quite sure that's down to AMD Catalyst driver updates. And in gaming, and this is where it gets particularly interesting, when the memory is increased in speed, in Tomb Raider at high presets, we were seeing an average of 23 frames per second. With the core speed and also the graphic speed increased, we saw 31 frames per second, which is way ahead of the MSI. Again, I'm quite sure down to driver updates. Now, when you're talking 31 frames per second at high presets, you can play that game. If you drop it down to normal presets, 36 frames per second, absolutely playable. This is full HD. So I've had to put my preconceptions about AMD Kaveri to one side. It's not a Core i3, and neither do I honestly think it's fit really for your old granny or some such. If you're building this system, you're building it because you want certain things and you don't want to pay a lot of money for it, and you're going to pick your components carefully, in which case this is what you're looking at. It's also worth noting that the drivers, I did almost laugh at this. There are very few drivers for installing your Kaveri system, in this case the Asus obviously. The chipset drivers, 1.69 gigabytes in size. Audio drivers, 700 megabytes. Intel Ethernet, that's it, you're done. 1.69 gigabytes for the chipset, 700 meg for the audio. No doubt a unified driver package covers all manner of OS, but even so, that's 2.5 gigabytes for 2 drivers. Absolutely epic. So there we have it. The problem with AMD Kaveri, it turns out, is me. I've finally come around to their way of seeing it. Mainly, I think, because the performance has gone up and up very slightly, a frame a second, and we've now hit the level where you can play proper games with this APU. Previously, you couldn't, it depended, and it works. The Asus A88X-Gamer, honestly, the name, it's a really good bit of hardware, and I'm so impressed by what they've delivered for so little money. You get a full set of features, low price, it really makes that APU work well. Nonetheless, just ignore this bit because you're not going to be using it. So there we have it. This is Leo Waldock for Kit Guru TV.